Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shashi from the Samruddh Bharat Foundation, and I very warmly welcome you all to this discussion on the Tryst. Joining me today is Prabhat Patnaik, a very prominent Marxian economist and political commentator. After studying at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and teaching at Cambridge, he spent the majority of his career at JNU in New Delhi, where he taught at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning until his retirement. His research primarily revolves around Marxist political economy, macroeconomics, and the structural impacts of imperialism and global finance. Alongside his academic work, he has engaged directly in public policy, serving as vice chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board and participating in a UN task force on global financial reform. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for joining us. So, today's discussion will be on neoliberalism and neofascism. So, I would want you to explain the links between neoliberalism and neofascism for our audience. Also, why is it that you say that with the collapse of the credibility of trickle-down economics, there was a flourish, a burgeoning of fascism across the globe?
Well, the first thing we should actually note is that the current trend of neo-fascism is confined not just to India, but is a global phenomenon. Everywhere, whether they are in power or not, there is an ascendancy of neo-fascism. There's Milei in Argentina, there's Trump in the United States, there's Orban in Hungary, there is Netanyahu in Israel, there is Modi in India, there is Meloni in Italy, there is Marine Le Pen in France, everywhere. So it's a global phenomenon. If it's a global phenomenon, then obviously it must have some root, which itself is sort of globally prevalent. And to my mind, that root consists in the fact of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Now, this crisis is something which, if you like, is the ultimate climax of neoliberalism. Why do I say that? Because neoliberalism has meant a substantial shift in the income distribution in income distribution away from the working classes in the advanced countries and the working people, which means the workers, peasants, petty producers, and so on, in countries like ours, towards those who live off the economic surplus. Now, this is something which is so clear and so powerful a phenomenon that, according to Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, the American economist who has made an estimate, you find that between 2011 and if you compare 2011 with 1968, then the real wage of an average male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. And this is a phenomenon which is true everywhere. Anybody who has studied income distribution would say that. Similarly, you look at a country like ours, where, for instance, the World Inequality Database that Piketty and others run in Paris shows that the share of the top 1% of the population in national income is now higher than at any time in the last 100 years. What is more, it was about 6% in 1982, and today it's about 23%, in excess marginally of 23%. So there is an enormous increase in inequality, which is expressive of the fact that there is a shift of income distribution from wages to surplus. Now, why that shift occurs is because of the fact that now capital is globalized, and that's a feature of neoliberal capitalism, while workers continue to work in their respective countries. You don't have trade unions straddling the globe. Therefore, an asymmetry has developed between the power of capital and the power of labor, because of which, if you find in any particular country workers go on a strike demanding higher wages, capital says, okay, I'm going to shift to Indonesia. So because of this, you actually have a situation where the workers' bargaining strength has greatly reduced, And what is more, even the shift to Indonesia or shift of capital from the first to the third world has not really exhausted the labor reserves of the third world. So the third world wages continue to remain at a subsistence level. The first world wages, in fact, become tied to the third world's labor reserves, and therefore they don't rise. So all over the world, you find that real wages, the vector of real wages does not rise, while labor productivity is rising, because of which there is a rise in the share of surplus, and this because of the fact that a unit of wage income is one from which more is consumed, a higher proportion is consumed than out of a unit of economic surplus. You find that this kind of an adverse income distribution shift implies a reduction in aggregate demand and therefore a tendency towards an overproduction crisis in the world economy and in particular countries, which basically means larger unemployment and so on. Now, if you have, obviously, you don't have, in the 1930s, fascism had arisen in the midst of the Great Depression. Now, you don't actually have a Great Depression, but you have a period of stagnation in which, of course, unemployment on the whole is larger than ever before in the recent past, though this unemployment is sometimes camouflaged in the form of a lower work participation rate, because if workers find there are no jobs, then they don't even report as themselves as workers. So altogether, therefore, there is a kind of stagnation that has crept into neoliberal capitalism. And this stagnation is inevitable because of the adverse income distribution shift in neoliberal capitalism. And when you have this kind of stagnation and larger unemployment, in that case, the hegemony of capital becomes threatened, and therefore, particularly of monopoly capital, and therefore they think of alternative ways of bolstering this hegemony, and they form an alliance with neo-fascist elements. In fact, the corporate Hindutva alliance, which you find in India, is expressive of a larger spectrum of such alliances prevailing in other countries as well.
So thank you for breaking down these economic roots so clearly. So I wanted to talk about the specific term that you use. So you prefer to use the term neo-fascism instead of fascism to describe these tendencies, the rise of far-right movements. So why is that? And in what ways is this neo-fascism distinct from the fascism of, say, the last century?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. You see, fascism in the 1930s, while it emerged during the Great Depression, actually, in the countries that went fascist, had the effect of overcoming the Great Depression. In fact, Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression, and that is when the military fascist government in Japan started kind of arming the country in preparation for a war. Likewise, Hitler's Germany in 1933, after Hitler came to power, was a country in Europe that came out of the Great Depression through larger military spending, and this spending was financed essentially by enormous fiscal deficits in Japan as well as in Germany, enormous fiscal deficits. Now, the point is that in today's world, because finance is globalized and finance does not want fiscal deficits, you have everywhere in the world fiscal responsibility legislation, except in the US, where you actually have fiscal deficits being limited to a certain percentage of the GDP. All over Europe, it's 3% of GDP. In our country, it's 3% for central government, 3% for state governments. So you have a situation where, on the one hand, the government cannot run a fiscal deficit beyond what is permitted. On the other hand, the government cannot tax the capitalists or the rich, because then capital would go out of your country to some other kind of, destination. And if you tax the workers to enlarge military expenditure or any other government expenditure, then that does not add to demand, because the workers or the working people more or less spend their entire income. So if you take 100 rupees from a worker and the government actually spends that same 100 rupees, then you reduce workers' demand by 100, even as the government's demand rises by 100. So there's no net increase in demand. So the net increase in demand would arise either if you have a larger government expenditure financed by a fiscal deficit, or financed by taxes on the surplus earners, neither of which is possible. And in that sense, therefore, contemporary neo-fascism is incapable of providing an expansionary stimulus to the economy the way the 1930s fascism had done. That's why I'm calling it neo-fascism. As a matter of fact, you see, in the 1930s, there was a period, for instance, between roughly, say in Germany, between 1933 when Hitler came to power and let's say 1939 when the horrors of the war became evident, when he had actually acquired a certain degree of popularity, because even though real wages had declined, but nonetheless unemployment had been overcome. And so there was a certain kind of, euphoria that, okay, this man has overcome unemployment in our country. But that is not what contemporary neo-fascism can do. And that is why contemporary neo-fascism would continue to harp entirely on the theme of otherizing some minority group. In other words, the only stock in trade they have is really generating hatred against a minority.
Okay. So, I mean, apart from the economic roots, what are the, of course, you talked about a few of these things, but what are the elements of continuity and change precisely? So,
Right. To my mind, there are a number of factors in contemporary neo-fascism which are reminiscent of the old classical fascism. The first, of course, is extraordinary repression. That is a common feature of fascism. The second is otherizing a minority group, whether it's the blacks, whether the Mexicans, whether it is the Muslims, whether some ethnic or religious minorities otherized, and you have the generation of hatred against that minority group as a means of bolstering the fascist regime. The third feature, which is common between classical as well as contemporary neo-fascism, is the fact that it is essentially something which has the backing of monopoly capital. I mean, in fact, fascist groups exist in all modern societies, but usually as fringe elements. They come center stage only when they get the financial backing as well as the media backing of monopoly capital. That's exactly what has happened in our country. That's exactly what you're finding elsewhere as well. So it is the backing of monopoly capital that's absolutely essential. In that sense, I must say, fascism as a phenomenon is a very modern phenomenon. That it may exploit divisions that may have existed in the past, but in itself is a very modern phenomenon, because monopoly capitalism itself is a very modern phenomenon. The fourth feature of fascism, which is also there in neo-fascism, certainly we see in India, is that within monopoly capitalism, fascism particularly promotes and supports and relies on the support of a new group of monopoly capitalists. You see, for instance, in Japan, you had the old Zaibatsu and you had the Shinko Zaibatsu that was particularly close to the military fascist regime. In Germany, according to the anarchist writer Daniel Gérin, you had the old monopolies, which were, let us say, in textiles and such like industries, and you found the new ones that were in iron and steel, shipbuilding, and so on, which were really much more aligned to the militarization program of the fascists, and they're very close to the fascists. Similarly, in our country, you find the Adanis and so on, the new monopoly groups, which are really much more to the fore and much closer to the fascist governments, neo-fascist governments. The fifth feature is, of course, the fact that fascism, it is not just repressive. Of course, it is repressive, but it combines state repression with the repression by the fascist thugs, by kind of, you have all kinds of fascist groups that go around terrorizing. You had the Balailas in Italy, and you had the Youth League, the Hitler's Youth, and therefore fascism is a movement. It's not just an authoritarian phenomenon. It's actually a movement, and it's a movement which actually uses young people, uses fascist thugs in order to terrorize, and that's an extra state agency which it invariably uses. The next phenomenon, which you find again common between classical fascism and contemporary neo-fascism, is the cult of the leader. That basically the nation is defined around a leader. If you're against the leader, you're anti-national. So that, as opposed to I mean, let us say you look at Gandhiji's notion of nationalism. Gandhiji's notion of the nation was that that wiping away the tears from the eyes of every Indian. In other words, the nation was supposed to serve the people. While what you have under fascism is that the people are supposed to serve the nation, and the nation is symbolized in the personality of the leader. Okay, and that's why there's a lot of emphasis on duty, not emphasis on rights, a lot of emphasis on duty under fascism. So these are all phenomena common between the current wave of neo-fascism, particularly I would say India is a classic example, and what had happened earlier.
Thank you so much, sir. This distinction, this emphasis on the elements of continuity and change is really helpful. So moving from this theoretical framework to a more immediate practical question. So we all are aware of the recent Indo-US trade deal, and it is being talked about extensively. So what I've been able to understand so far is that it's quite lopsided and it does not make much economic sense for India. So how can we situate these things in our discussion? And what does it say about the relationship between the global North and the global South in, in this framework?
Well, okay. I would say that currently, as I mentioned earlier, neoliberal capitalism is really facing a certain crisis of, is facing a threat. Now, the threat arises for two reasons. One, I have already discussed, namely that its hegemony is threatened by the stagnation and unemployment, which is coming on top of the fact that wages were not rising. So that it actually means, on average, per working population, there is a decline in the living standards. This is evident in India, for instance, in the new book that Prabhat Patnaik has written, in which she shows that poverty in absolute terms in India has actually increased in terms of the poverty-stricken population being a larger percentage of the population in 2017-18 than it was, let us say, when neoliberalism began. So that is one part of the crisis. But the second part, which has not received as much attention, is that the entire post-war period was characterized by the fact that the leading capitalist country did not have a colonial empire. You see, Britain had a colonial empire, but America didn't actually have a colonial empire. Because it did not have a colonial empire, I'm not saying that had it had a colonial empire, it could have overcome the problem I'm going to discuss in a moment. But it did not even have a colonial empire, because of which when, the leading capitalist country has to undertake a lot of expenditures, it necessarily runs a balance of payments deficit, necessarily. In the case of the United States, one very important reason it runs the deficit is because it actually runs 750 bases in 80 countries of the world. Now, if the US has to spend on that, then of course that appears as a current account deficit of the United States. Now, all these deficits, the United States funds by simply printing dollars, as because of which you have the most powerful capitalist country of the world today being the most indebted. And this is not what happened to British colonialism or to the British Empire. The British Empire ran current account deficits, exported capital, but it actually obtained resources from its colonial empire, from India through the drain of surplus that people like Dadabhai Nauroji wrote about, and through deindustrializing textile exports to India and China. So if you have a colonial empire, you have an advantage, namely your markets on tap, which is what a British economic historian once referred to. Your markets on tap, and you can actually take away the export surplus of all these countries for your own benefit. And that's how Britain actually managed without getting into debt. On the contrary, it meant capital exports, while the US is the most indebted. Now, if you're an indebted nation, in that case, your currency, which is the dominant currency in the world, also faces a threat. Now, if it faces a threat, typically people say that, look, how can the dollar face a threat? Because there's no other currency anywhere near the dollar, which is true. But on the other hand, it can face a threat in the sense that there might be a flight from the dollar to commodities, from the dollar to oil, in which case the commodity prices would rise. There would be a huge inflation all over the capitalist world. This is not a phenomenon which I am, as it were, conjuring up. This is exactly what had happened in the early 70s. When you remember, when de Gaulle actually wanted to move away from dollar to gold, all over the world there was a panic. People moved away from dollar and they moved into commodities. Therefore, there's a huge commodity price boom. Later, that boom collapsed, but oil prices continued to remain high. But that gave rise to an enormous inflation, which was combated by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan by creating huge unemployment. And but you see, that unemployment came in a situation where the working class had benefited from the post-war boom. But you already have a situation where the working class is suffering from stagnation, from adverse income distribution. And if you have a sudden eruption of inflation, to combat which on capitalist conditions you would have to have huge further unemployment, then that poses a social stability to the entire capitalist order. Now, therefore, the two ways in which the stability is being sought to be countered, one, of course, is the emergence of fascism, as I mentioned, but the neo-fascism, but the other is an attempt to, I would say, recolonize the world, in the sense that you take over, let us say Greenland has some raw materials, you try and take over Greenland. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, you take over Venezuela. Iran has oil reserves, you take over Iran. Therefore, if Iran, Venezuela, all these countries, oil is now going to be developed by American companies, then in effect, it is a new kind of drain that the US would be getting, comparable to the British drain of the 19th century or before the First World War. And this is something which would actually help in some sense, so Trump believes, to strengthen the dollar. Okay. Now the point is whether it strengthens the dollar, whether and so on is not very important. The important point is that this is the way that Trump believes that the threat to the hegemony of the dollar can be countered. Making America great again implies strengthening the dollar above all. And one way of strengthening the dollar is to recolonize the world by by establishing control over large parts of the raw material producing third world by the US, supported by other imperialisms. You find, for instance, the entire attack on Iran hardly has been condemned by any European country. Okay, so and recently there was a speech by Marco Rubio, you must have seen that, which actually outlines, if you like, this exact agenda, but of course puts it in terms not of capitalism, but in terms of Western civilization.
So, I mean, we have now discussed, I mean, the economic roots of fascism and the rise of these movements. What do you think are some effective ways to sort of say counteract its influence? Like you talk about wealth tax, inheritance tax. So, what can say progressive political parties, the left, the Congress, what they can do under these circumstances, and what do you think is the way forward?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, obviously, I think politically there has to be a broad united front, because you don't fight fascism just by the left or by this party or that party alone. There has to be a fairly broad united front. But again, because of the difference between fascism of the 30s and contemporary neo-fascism, where I said that contemporary neo-fascism is incapable of resolving the problem that neoliberalism has thrown up through its development, unless you come up with a people's with an agenda that actually improves the condition of the people, even if you defeat the neo-fascists in an election, they'll come back next time. So the whole point is that, to overcome neo-fascism, you must overcome the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. And that conjuncture, to my mind, is a conjuncture characterized by a crisis of neoliberalism. Now, the crisis of neoliberalism cannot be resolved within neoliberalism itself. So you'll have to go beyond neoliberalism. And one way that you have to go beyond neoliberalism is by re-establishing welfare state measures. Okay. Now, to my mind, because I'm a part of the left, I believe that this re-establishment is something that would actually lead dialectically towards the strengthening an arrival of socialism. But on the other hand, we don't have to argue about. I mean, let us forget about socialism. But fundamentally, it must be towards introducing welfare state measures, bringing about in some ways the kind of policies which had prevailed in Nehruvian India, except that now we have to have a much greater emphasis on employment and so on. Because one of the failures of that period is the fact that even though the employment growth was there, the employment growth was not greater than the rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, you did not make an impact on the unemployment situation that we had inherited from colonial times. Now, I think there has to be much greater emphasis on employment generation, much greater emphasis on raising the rate of agricultural growth, but we have to have protection of the country from all these all these free trade agreements that are happening are absurd, because they're against the interests of the farmers, they're against the interests of the working people. So we have to have an alternative. Now, the way I see the alternative, the way we can actually make an intervention, is by having a set of fundamental economic rights. You see, we did not have in the Constitution, even though we had civil and political rights, we did not have any fundamental economic rights. Now, we made some calculations, namely that if you have 5 fundamental economic rights, one is the right to food, where we calculated that suppose you give everybody, not just the BPL population, food exactly on the terms they used to get prior to the pandemic. Okay. Secondly, you have a right to employment in which everybody either has employment or, failing the state's provision of employment, is given a wage, not an unemployment allowance, but a wage. a right to free, publicly provided, along the lines of a national health service, universal health care, like you have in Britain or in Scandinavian countries, or you had in the Soviet Union in the old days. Similarly, a right to free, quality, publicly funded education, free education, and a right to a living old age pension and corresponding disability benefits. We calculated that if you have these 5 fundamental economic rights, they can be funded by simply imposing 2 taxes on the top 1% of the population. I'm now talking only of the financial side. Of course, you need to get real resources and so on corresponding to the finance. But on the financial side, these 2 taxes would be a 2% wealth tax only on the top 1% of the population, and a 1/3 inheritance tax only on the top 1% of the population. Now, it is utterly shocking that in India we have neither. That we don't have inheritance tax in India is particularly shocking because, the philosophy of capitalism says, philosophy of capitalism, that capitalists get their income not because they are earning a surplus at the expense of the workers, but because they have some special talent. Okay, what the talent is a matter on which there are differences. They can take risks, they're innovative, etc., etc., whatever it is. Suppose we grant that argument. Their children must show that talent, same talent, before they can be entitled to a similar income. Because of which, most advanced capitalist countries have fairly heavy inheritance taxation in the form, of course, only of death duties. What I was suggesting is inheritance taxation whenever any property is passed on to progeny or anybody else. So Japan, for instance, has 55% death duty. In other words, if I die and I leave 100 rupees for my child, in that case, 55 rupees of that will be taken away by the state. Similarly, UK, USA have 40% death duty. So inheritance taxation is an accepted phenomenon under capitalism, but in India, zero. I mean, it's just amazing. Similarly, wealth taxation is talked about. For instance, Bernie Sanders in the US had talked about wealth taxation, fairly heavy wealth taxation. Elizabeth Warren, who was also a candidate for US presidency, had talked about wealth taxation. Again, at rates much higher than what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting a 2% wealth tax only on the top 1% of the population. Bernie Sanders had suggested a graded wealth tax where the maximum was 7%. Okay, now that's a lot. So I'm suggesting a wealth tax. So if you impose these 2 taxes, in that case, you would be able to a welfare state with all these with fundamental economic rights. Now, of course, if you're thinking of a broad political front, then it is quite possible that many of your allies may not agree to all these, having all these rights or imposing these taxes. Mind you, at the moment, almost all political parties are giving what are called these days freebies. In other words, they simply give, but rather than that, I would much, because those appear as largesse, as gifts by the government.
Yeah.
We are giving you this, give us your votes. But I think that is inimical to the dignity of the citizen. The dignity of the citizen implies that every citizen of India must be entitled to a decent living standard. It's not anybody's charity. It's not something for which the citizen has to be grateful. It's not something which can be withdrawn at a moment's notice, but this is something which has to be incorporated as a right. Now, I think, as I mentioned, not all political formations you want to come on board against the neo-fascist one may agree to all this, but even if one or two of these are immediately implemented, for instance, a national health service, that would go an enormously long way in changing the lives of millions of people. I mean, there's horrendous stories about peasants in Uttar Pradesh coming to Delhi because their child is not well, being forced to admit the child in some private hospital. Then they can't meet the private hospital bill. They have to go and sell off their land. And at the end of it, often the child doesn't even survive. So you've lost both your child and your land. I mean, this is just not acceptable. In a modern democratic society, it's just not acceptable. So I think even if we have one or two of the five rights I've been talking about, that should be a starting point for incorporating into a program of a united front against neo-fascism.
Thank you, sir. So, I mean, you were talking about economic rights and how they need to be made justiciable, and of course, this should be included in fundamental rights. So, I think you discuss about two kinds of skepticism towards these fundamental economic rights. One is liberal, one is Marxist. So, the Marxist one comes from Marx's Jewish question, where he says apparently that the rights of man are nothing but the rights of an egotistic man. So, could you please explain that a bit?
Well, okay, the the liberal objection to rights consists in the fact that unless the argument goes as follows: unless you can actually fulfill these rights, there's no point having them. And when they talk about fulfilling these rights, they're always talking in the context of a capitalist society. Okay. Now, obviously, in the context of contemporary capitalism, which is neoliberal capitalism, you can't fulfill these rights. The whole idea is to go beyond neoliberal capitalism. Even if I'm not making any claims about socialism and so on, at least let's go towards a welfare capitalism. Okay. The point is that the liberal objection to rights hinges upon the fact that rights introduce a necessary transformation of capitalism, which liberals are not willing to countenance. I mean, I'm not saying all liberals, but a few liberals, I mean, some liberals, or the liberal philosophical objection is based on this. The Marxist objection arises from the fact that, look, the Marxist perception is the formation of a new community. That capitalism has destroyed the old community. It has formed a group of atomized individuals. And the whole idea is to form a new community by transcending capitalism. Or, the formation of new community is something which is part of the process of transcendence of capitalism. And of course, it is what transcends the capitalism, makes the revolution to go beyond capitalism. Okay. And the trade unions and combinations are the embryonic form of the formation of that new community. Now, therefore, the idea is that if you have individual rights, then that individual right is actually apotheosizing the individual. You're not actually emphasizing the notion of the community. But I think Marx had mentioned this in the Jewish question. But on the other hand, Marx's own attitude, and certainly the attitudes of the Marxists towards rights, is more complex than that, because Marx, after all, talked about the rights of workers to go on a strike. So that, it's not as if there's something wrong with rights per se. True, he mentioned it in the Jewish question, but that was a period in which his ideas were being formed. But I think Marx certainly would not be opposed to the idea of these rights, particularly because I have an understanding of Marxism where, Marxism does not substitute the community for the individual. The perception of Marxism is not that the individual is obliterated, that you forget about yourself and you only work for the society and so on. No. Marxism sees the individual as a person whose individual aspirations realized by being part of a whole, by being part of a community. So it's a more complex notion of the individual embedded within a community, but not the individual obliterated by the community. Okay. Now, if that is the case, then I think it's very important that the right should be there, and of course the community would fulfill these rights. Obviously, in a socialist society, you don't have unemployment. In a socialist society, you do have free healthcare. In a socialist society, you do have free education. You do have free kind of, pensions, non-contributory pensions, and so on. So that all these rights I'm talking about would be automatically fulfilled in a socialist society. But on the other hand, they need also to be incorporated explicitly into the constitution of a socialist society. And of course, in the very process of fighting for these rights within capitalism, you strengthen the formation of the community. Because after all, you don't fight for these rights individually, you fight for them as a group. And therefore, it actually furthers group consciousness and therefore social community consciousness. So I don't see the Marxist objection to rights as being philosophically well founded, at least the way it's interpreted. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. And it was a really very enriching and insightful discussion. And I hope our audience will benefit a lot from this. So this discussion, as I told you, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And as soon as it is done, I'll share the link with you. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
No,